Welcome to Speak Life with Dr. Amy Chai. Information for your best life. Now, here's Amy Chai.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Speak Life New Haven. Today, I'm going to talk about something really kind of controversial, and it touches on so many areas of life. It touches on economics, it touches on equity and oppression. It talks about politics and money and health and mental health and kids and prison. All of those things go hand in hand when we're talking about greed and weed. So, when I'm going to start out and talk about this really important topic, um, I guess you all know that weed has become legalized now in Connecticut. And there's been a lot of drama around who's selling the weed and who's able to sell the weed. And I heard one person say, it used to be that you would get weed on the black market, but now you get weed on the white market. And what they're trying to say is that big business owned by wealthy white people has sort of taken over the weed industry that has decimated the African American community for so long with long prison sentences and unfair practices that targeted minorities. And that's very true. The reason we have legalized weed in Connecticut today is really it's a financial choice. And we also know that banking with weed is a unique situation because it's still illegal on a federal level. So there has to be certain bankers that have a certain ability to finance and run weed-based companies. And these financial institutions, a lot of them are run by people with connections to our political system, as you can imagine. Is legalized weed good? Is legalized weed bad? What should you think about legalized weed? And what do I, as a physician, think about this whole marijuana situation? And also about what it will do and what it is doing to the young people in our beautiful state of Connecticut. So I want to bring you back in time to the distant past. Well, not that distant, actually. It was a time when smoking was being promoted by big tobacco in order to get people addicted to cigarettes. Now, of course, what they're going to do is they're going to do something really special, and they're going to say that your doctor smokes Camel cigarettes. And this is where we get this big promotion about 4 out of 5 doctors, will smoke Camels as their preferred cigarettes. So having doctors involved in the marketing of cigarettes was great for the tobacco industry because it gave it this sheen, this special health related authority. It made it seem like, tobacco is good, tobacco is healthy, tobacco won't harm you. And of course, we know now that that's not true. So many people were addicted to smoking, and so many people are still addicted to smoking. And it causes horrible things like lung cancer and COPD and heart attacks, and a lot of other different cancers and strokes, and just so many difficult problems are caused by tobacco. And when they were selling tobacco, and they're trying to get people, also women interested in smoking tobacco, they added a lot of other things to the health claims of tobacco. They claimed that it would decrease your appetite so that when you're feeling hunger pangs, you just take a cigarette and you're going to lose weight. And then they also used an ad like this that I'm showing here, that these cigarettes cure a multitude of problems, including, believe it or not, asthma. So it was sort of marketed as a natural cure all for a lot of different health problems. And because there was no real evidence to the contrary, they had no reason legally that they couldn't say that. It was basically health related claims that were unsubstantiated by actual facts and actual research. And it probably took, well, it took about 60 years for doctors and researchers to prove that smoking caused lung cancer. And that's a long time. And by then, a lot of people were addicted, a lot of people were dying, and a lot of people were already dead. So, the smoking of cigarettes, it was heavily promoted in order, of course, to make more money for big tobacco and the tobacco industry. And it wasn't till probably the 1960s when they started talking about labels with the Surgeon General telling you that smoking's actually hazardous to your health. So after they got the men with the doctors smoking, and then they got the women telling them about how it's a cure-all that'll make you thin. But who else can they get? Well, we all know that people who don't smoke when they're young won't typically develop smoking later in life. So if you want somebody to be addicted to something, it's very, very important to get them addicted while they're still young. So that's why tobacco companies targeted the youth market, even though supposedly people weren't allowed to purchase cigarettes below the age of 18. They had this notorious character, and this character was called Joe the Camel. So Joe the Camel was like a very hip, very fun cartoon character. And who's going to be attracted to a cartoon character? Well, not adults. It's going to be children. And Joe the Camel, here you see in this photo, Joe the Camel is hanging out on a fire escape with his cool buddies, and he's smoking Camel cigarettes. So this ad was explicitly designed to target young children. And so now we see the same thing going on with vaping of marijuana products. Now here we also see something called BART carts. Now these BART carts are flavored vape inserts, and the flavored vape inserts have different flavors, like watermelon, fruit flavor, bubblegum flavor. And they're in these colorful cartoon packages. And who do you think that's targeting? Adults? I don't think so. It's like, when was the last time you wanted bubblegum flavored anything, right? This is specifically designed to target children, and it's working. So we know that the average age of marijuana users is anywhere from 12 years old to about 25 years old. And that's exactly the demographic that should not be using addictive substances. Why? Well, because addictive substances, when used in childhood, dramatically increase your risk of having long-term addiction problems. And as many as 50% of young people, especially when they start very young, like in the 12 to 14 age group, as many as 50% of them with pretty much daily use will develop an addictive problem. And that addictive problem, in many cases, will progress into harder drugs like cocaine and like heroin. So, and it's not just the THC vape containers, it's also something called K2 and Spice, which they're sold in cute little packets. They're small little square packets about this big. and it's called potpourri. Well, it isn't actually potpourri, it's actually a synthetic marijuana. And this can be purchased pretty much at any bodega. It just looks like a little bit of herbs in a package. And what it is it's synthetic marijuana. And that also has a great deal of side effects. So, what we see here is the purposeful addiction of our youth for money. And that's exactly what this is. And how are they doing it? They're using something called perception of safety. And the perception of safety for marijuana has been going up recently because we've heard a lot of propaganda about how marijuana is safe, it's natural, it's a leaf, and it treats all sorts of illnesses. Now, where have we heard that before? Well, we've heard it with the tobacco. It's like literally exactly what the tobacco companies did when they're trying to addict people to their product. Now, why would they want to addict people to their product? Well, the reason is that the sales of marijuana in the United States right now are $5.8 billion per month for the United States. And if you take that out over a year, it's almost $70 billion. It's like the amount of money that we've spent on the war in Ukraine so far in the first year. So it's a huge, huge amount of money. And if you're going to get lifelong users, you have to hook them young, okay? Because otherwise they're not going to pick it up later on in life. So the perception of safety, when the perception of safety goes up, the use of drugs also goes up. Because when people think it's safe, then they use it more. When people think it's dangerous, they use it less. And that's what this graph right here shows. It shows that the use of marijuana does go up the more people think that it's safe and the more people think that it's going to help them somehow. But what this really is all about is about greed. It's about money. And it's about trying to tell people that it's safe, especially telling young people that it's safe. Now, this is called the addiction spectrum. And addiction isn't just a one and done phenomenon. Addiction starts out, you know, very, very mild with the casual user. There's nothing wrong with using a substance casually. Like, say you're going to, on the weekend, get together with some friends, have a couple of drinks, or have a couple of marijuana cigarettes or whatever you're going to have. That's casual use. And as long as you're not driving, as long as you're not harming anyone else, that's a right and a freedom that seems very reasonable for people to engage in if they're mature adults that are responsible for their behavior. And that's the kind of use that should potentially be okay. But then you have the at-risk user. The at-risk user is someone who starts using it more and more, or using it more than once a day, to the point where it's starting to be something that they think about a lot and they really enjoy doing it maybe a little bit much, okay? And then you have the pre-addiction, which is people who kind of use it on a daily basis, and they realize that they kind of can't give it up, but yet it's not really impacting their daily life in ways that they really can see. Like, they haven't had a DUI, they haven't had like something really bad happen to them, their family isn't trying to kick them out of the house or anything like that. And that's the pre-addiction phase. And then there's the full-blown substance use disorder. And that's where someone, perhaps they get arrested for driving under the influence. Perhaps they don't make it to work, they lose a job. Perhaps they find it hard getting out of bed, they lack motivation. They start having to have problems, and people around them are noticing that they have problems. So it's kind of a spectrum. And what we see is that the young people who start early using marijuana, at least 10% of them will develop pre-addiction, and 10% to 50% will develop pre-addiction. And people who use any kind of substance, be it alcohol, marijuana, or any of these other addictive substances before the age of 18 have a substantially higher risk of having significant problems with addiction later on in life. So if you can get somebody to age 21 without using any substance at all, chances are good that they're not going to end up in the gutter. But if people are using it as a young person, that's a very high risk thing to be doing. And that's why it's so harmful to market to children. So marijuana has some good effects. It has positive effects, would be like a feeling of well-being when used on the short term, and perhaps a feeling of a euphoria, which is the high that they talk about, a feeling of slowed perception of time. It's like a feeling of calm or peacefulness or relaxation. And that's why people use marijuana. But what happens to marijuana in use in the adolescent brain? And so here I have a picture of the adolescent brain. And the part that you see that's a very red color is called the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex. That part of the brain is the last part of the brain to develop. And it doesn't fully develop until age 25. Now, this part of the brain is the center of your personality. It's the center of your mental health. It's the center of your decision making and your motivation and your reward. So, what happens when young people with an undeveloped brain start using psychoactive drugs? Well, let's talk about what happens in the case of marijuana. Young people's brains are more susceptible to the marijuana effects, and it can actually cause a lot of psychological and mental problems. It can also cause a decrease in IQ, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the thing I want to bring out is that the adolescents really, because their brain is not finished developing, really should not be exposed to any addictive substances. And that's especially why the marketing to young people is so very disastrous. And as you can see with some of the things I showed you before, this is something that's going on very prominently in the vaping, especially in the vaping cartridge industry. Now, the other group of people, believe it or not, who are actually using marijuana at much increased rate is young women. Now, young women previously hadn't been that heavily into marijuana, but they really are now. And, you know, if you're going to be using marijuana as a female, you really need to be using birth control, because psychoactive substances, addictive substances, affect the developing brain of the fetus. Just like the adolescent brain isn't developed, well, the fetal brain is even less well developed. And THC, it crosses the placenta and it also crosses into breast milk. So you get THC going into the fetus and into the nursing baby, and you get developmental problems. You get ADHD, you get behavioral problems, you get low birth weights, and marijuana is not safe in pregnancy. But there's a lot of women now that are pregnant and they're using marijuana, and that's like really not healthy at all. And let's see if I can get the next slide up. Okay. Psychological effects on the fetus and especially on the adolescent brain are very prominent. And while in the short term, marijuana, you're going to be getting the calm, the well being, the slow time perception. And those are kind of good, positive, short term effects that you're going to maybe feel good. If you use marijuana in the long term, you're going to have problems with anxiety. You're going to have problems with a decreased IQ. You're going to have problems with memory difficulty. You're going to have trouble concentrating. And if you have any history at all of mental illness in your family, you could actually develop full blown paranoid schizophrenia. Now, marijuana doesn't cause paranoid schizophrenia, but what it does do is it can actually trigger it in genetically susceptible people. Now, if you have a family history of certain mental health problems, you may or you may not get that mental health problem, like bipolar disorder or, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety. These things do run in families, but not everybody gets it because it's not a autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive gene like you would get for eye color or something else like that. It's usually has some other factor that kind of triggers it. So if you have any family history of mental illness, then marijuana can certainly precipitate that mental illness in you. So it's very concerning because we do know that a certain number of people, they say about 13% potentially of schizophrenia has been triggered by the use of marijuana, which is really our most commonly used and abused drug that we have. And so, even though it does have some short term effects that are pleasant, it can have long term effects that are very unpleasant. And in fact, sometimes we get people with their very first panic attack the first time they try marijuana. Okay, so what about cardiovascular effects? Now, there are receptors, they're called cannabis receptors. There's type 1 and type 2 cannabis receptors in the body. Type 1 is in the brain, and type 2 is, in the rest of the body. So our heart also has CB receptors. And there are heart effects of cannabis on the heart. And one of them is elevated blood pressure, elevated heart rate. And there is within about 1 hour of smoking marijuana, there is an increased risk of heart attack. And there's also something very else unique. If you have some sort of heart blockage, let's say you get a little bit of chest pressure if you walk up 2 flights of stairs. Now, marijuana is going to decrease the amount of exercise it takes to where you get to that point where you get the chest pain or chest pressure. Like, say it took 2 flights of stairs to get the chest pressure. Now, when you smoke the marijuana, it's only going to take 1 flight of stairs to get that chest pressure. So it reduces the level at which you're going to feel the blockages in your heart. So it's really very rare for a young person to get a heart attack after smoking marijuana. But we do know that there's a significant percentage of the heart attacks that do occur in people under the age of 50 that really probably wouldn't happen if not for marijuana. So this particular aspect of the cardiovascular effect is more important for older people, but it's also important for younger people to be aware of. If you do develop chest pain after smoking marijuana, you really need to get it checked out because it could be your heart. So that's potentially a very big problem. So, You may have heard that marijuana does not cause addiction or withdrawal, but that's actually not true. It does cause addiction. It's very hard to treat. There are some treatments that do work. I'm not going to tell you right here what they are because that would be for your doctor to discuss. There are some medications that do help with marijuana addiction, but it's much harder to treat than some other types of addictions because we don't have really, really good treatments for it. So, what we find is that about 70% of people that we treat for marijuana addiction, they do relapse and they go back to smoking regularly. Um, when people do stop using marijuana, they tend to have these withdrawal symptoms, and I've listed them here for you to look at. Um, the definition for having withdrawal from marijuana is that you would have one physical symptom, and the one physical symptom is probably most commonly being really sweaty or having sweaty episodes, or just sometimes your face will be beaded with sweat. You could even have a fever at some point. You could be a little shaky or a little off, headaches, stomach upset. Um, we usually would like to see one symptom of physical symptom to define it as a withdrawal from cannabis. And then there's also you'd want to see three non-physical symptoms like irritability or anxiety, trouble sleeping or sleeping disturbances, depression, restlessness, or decreased appetite. And those are the most common, those are going to be the most common types of withdrawal symptoms. Now, those symptoms of withdrawal, they can actually last for quite some time. But most commonly, they'll be mostly over in about 2 weeks. But some people do have this sort of withdrawal pattern for a couple of months or more. And then there's always the sort of the psychological craving that people have to deal with too. And that can also be kind of problematic. So here, let me go back here. So in summary, I think I just want to pull things together. If you hear something is kind of a cure-all or kind of a panacea for everything that ails you, it's probably not. It's probably someone trying to sell you some snake oil. And that's the case with marijuana, just like it was for cigarettes. The second thing is that people trying to sell this product made a big argument about how this was going to help the communities of color, but actually they wanted to sell it themselves so they can make more money. So the distribution of this product in our state has not really been a minority owned enterprise. So they basically, well, they were somewhat dishonest about that because it was all about getting the money and getting the special banks that finance it. So it wasn't really about helping the Black community at all. The third thing I wanted to mention is that there's a lot of problems with young people using marijuana. And because people are most likely to use marijuana between the ages of 12 to 25, those are the very people who are most likely to develop the addiction problems, and they're most likely to develop problems with motivation, not being able to get out of bed in the morning, not feeling like doing anything, feeling depressed, feeling anxious, eating a lot of food, just kind of dropping off the radar at school, just not doing as well. And some of them even developing a paranoid type of personality. And it can even lower the IQ. And right now, we're not even sure that this is completely reversible once this is stopped. We're not sure if this is reversible in young people, although it seems that it's probably reversible in older people. The earlier you start, the more possibility it is for you to have some sort of permanent damage. So if you're going to smoke marijuana, it's important that you know the potential risks, and it's important that you keep it away from people who are under the age of 21 at all costs. And if you're going to be expecting, you're not going to want to be smoking marijuana while you're pregnant or while you're breastfeeding your baby. So marijuana is legal. I think we're going to probably see a lot more problems with addiction, and that's my job. So I guess I'll get more business. I don't want business, but because we already don't have enough staff to handle all the addictions. But I just want you to be aware of the risks, and I want you to know to keep it away from kids. And that is all I have to say about marijuana today. And come back for more Speak Life next time.
Tune in next time for Speak Life with Dr. Amy Chai at ctpolitics.tv.